The world of pop culture is no stranger to great and influential combatants within the arena of law. Jeffrey Winger, Ella Woods, Phoenix Wright, Saul Goodman, Matthew Murdock, Asmodeus? Hello and welcome to Legend Lore, the show where we dive into the unknown and forgotten histories of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the real-life history of the game, in the hopes of providing you at home with information, inspiration, or at least some entertainment. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most mundane yet incredibly compelling and bizarre events of D&D's sordid past. The time every single one of the good aligned gods who reside in the holy plane of Mount Celestia decided to take Asmodeus, Lord of the Ninth Circle of Hell, Prince of Evil, Supreme Master of the Nine, to court. But before we get to the juiciest courtroom drama to ever unfurl in a fantasy setting, let me give you some context, because this wasn't the only time Asmodeus had been dragged to court and made to defend himself in front of a judge. The true beginning of our tale today traces all the way back to the days before the events of the Blood War had begun. For those who haven't opened a history textbook in a while, the Blood War was, and still is, a conflict which rages on to this day between the chaotic demons of the Abyss and the lawful devils of the Nine Hells. The Blood War could honestly be its own topic for a deep dive, and maybe I'll make that video someday, but as for its relevance to today's events, all you really need to know is that it hasn't started yet, and the burden of keeping the demonic incursion from the Abyss at bay had not yet fallen on the shoulders of the devils and those who reside within the Nine Hells. You see, back in those days, the pantheon of gods from all across the spectrum were getting tired of the endless gruesome battles fought against the infinite hordes of the chaotic demons that flowed out of the Abyss. They were tired of fighting, and they were becoming much more interested in creating new things, like intelligent creatures. So while the gods went off to make elves and dwarves and gnomes for some reason, they made sure to leave behind some divine protectors. After all, leaving the demons to their own devices unchecked was straight up not an option, as they would eventually destroy and corrupt the entire multiverse, including their cool new projects. So these mighty defenders created by the gods would remain at the fringes of the Abyss and protect the domain of the gods in their stead. They were made up of many different types of creatures, but this is where the first angels, archons, and many other powerful celestial beings came from. The most fearsome and powerful of these celestial warriors was an archangel named, you guessed it, Asmodeus. Under his command, Asmodeus's forces battled back the demonic hordes. However, as the ages ticked by, he and his soldiers began to experience one of the most unsettling realities of the Abyss and its influence. See, the Abyss is not just a realm of evil, but a realm of chaos. The demons it belches forth are often nightmarish beasts, no two looking quite the same, but all possessing an inherent wrongness. And the plane itself, the Abyss, spreads wantonly if not stopped, and warps all places and peoples it touches into chaotic, ever-changing facsimiles of what they once were. There is a theory that the Abyss is not really evil, but rather chaotic and merely occupied by countless evil creatures, and therefore it's merely conforming to the nature of its residents, but it's unclear which came first in this regard. Though I did get way more into that topic in my video about Pale Knight, the oldest living demon in the Abyss, so if you want to learn more about that, you should check it out. But as this all relates to our story today, the energy of the Abyss, which seeped out of every foul demon Asmodeus and his brethren felled, gradually, on a timeline unfathomable to most mortals, began to twist and corrupt the celestial defenders into monstrous forms that more closely resembled the shapes of the demons they fought, rather than the deities who created them. They also became much more aggressive and violent in battle, clearly empowered by the influence of the Abyss, but they still sought to use this power to the benefit of the gods and slaying of the demons. This behavior frightened the other celestial warriors who had not spent as much time on the front lines, and eventually they confronted Asmodeus about it, demanding answers and voicing concern that he and his armies had started down a path from which there would be no coming back if they were to go too far down it. Asmodeus, however, defended their demonic adaptations. He claimed correctly that these forms were more powerful and would aid them in battle against the demons. He also made an argument to suggest that he would simply just not become corrupted, and more or less put forth a value proposition that it was better for them to risk corruption and ensure victory over their foes. Asmodeus was straight up pissed about this, as if a bunch of angels who were younger than him by eons and were protecting areas far removed from the front lines were out here trying to tell him how to fight demons. They couldn't begin to fathom his experience on the battlefield. His mind had been sharpened to the finest point imaginable when it came to military strategy, and his body had been sculpted into the form of an apex predator, a being capable of doling out death with frightening precision and demoralizing brutality alike. The war had literally been his entire life since the moment of his creation. He was bound to fight the demons, and not only was he holding the line, he was pushing the abyss back. He was reclaiming territory. He was doing a better job than even the gods at slaughtering the demons who would seek to take everything from them. How could they not see that? All fears and concerns of the other Celestials eventually became so prevalent that the gods of Mount Celestia were forced to pay attention to distant battles at the edge of the multiverse once again, and like a concerned parent who just watched their child scaring all the other kids at daycare, they dragged Asmodeus aside for a stern talking to. Though, that analogy kind of falls apart pretty much instantly because you see, Asmodeus had a little trick up his sleeve called the judicial branch.
I believe that until proven guilty, every man, woman, and child in this country is innocent.
He had a vast and profound understanding of celestial law, better in fact even than the gods themselves. This is of course because while the gods were off forming the material plane and populating it with smarter monkeys who were able to weave cloth and get depression, many of these laws were being created to accommodate the ever-changing circumstances at the edge of the multiverse, and Asmodeus had helped write them. But given the concerns of all the other Celestials, these gods wanted to cast Asmodeus and his boys out of Mount Celestia, and thus they held a trial, which was officiated by the god of valor, Hieronius. During the trial, Asmodeus cited that the first duty of all truly lawful beings was to destroy chaos in all its forms, and in the war against chaotic beings from the abyss, it was clear he more than excelled at upholding the tenets of law and order, even if his appearance was unsettling to the others. And to Asmodeus, his unseemly form was merely a sacrifice made by him and his brethren, which both accomplished their goal of mounting a successful defense and spared the others from undergoing the same fate on the front lines. If anything, he was doing them all a favor. And honestly, I couldn't explain this better than the man himself, so to quote the text detailing these events verbatim, Asmodeus smiled. The smoke of 1,000 battlefields rose from his lips. As Lord of Battle, he pointed out, you should know better than any that war is a dirty business. We have blackened ourselves so that you can remain golden. We have upheld the laws, not broken them. Therefore, you may not cast us out. The gods huddled together to discuss what they had heard. Great was their consternation when they could find no counters in their tablets of law to Asmodeus' arguments. The Dark Angel knew their laws better than they did, and he could wield their clauses like a knife. It wasn't long before the gods realized they were outmatched and simply had no lawful reason to chastise, let alone banish, Asmodeus and his warriors. Thus, he was allowed to return to the front lines and continue the fight against the demons, the infernal transformation of he and his kin becoming more and more apparent with each passing eon. This initial confrontation between Asmodeus and his creators was the first, but certainly not the last time he would prove himself to be a formidable opponent to the gods. Eventually, this gradual corruption taking hold of the celestial warriors would see them transformed into something entirely different from what they once were, and thus the first true devils were born. Creatures with the lawful sense of duty inherent to their celestial progenitors, but with all the impulses towards good overwritten by a callous evil and cruelty. And when they finally did turn the corner from angel to devil, Asmodeus and his followers would entreat the gods to sign a document known as the Pact Primeval, a document which ultimately allowed for the creation of the 9 hells, separating the devils from the celestials and formalizing the beginning of an ancient conflict known as the Blood War. The Blood War is possibly one of the most in-depth and well-documented ongoing events in the history of D&D, and its history touches on basically every demonic, devilish, and celestial faction in some way or another, but it serves primarily as the backdrop for our main topic of today's video, Asmodeus and the many, many crimes he was accused of during the early days of the conflict. And now, we're gonna talk about it, at least we would if I had all the world building notes I'd prepared and they were organized in a convenient and easy to access way. Has this ever happened to you? Well, worry not, because with World Anvil, you can lose those disorganized world building notes and be the world building GOAT. World Anvil is the ultimate all-in-one software for tabletop gamers and GMs alike. You can use it to make your own personalized database, complete with interactive maps, D&D stat blocks, and tons of tools specifically designed to help you achieve all your RPG-related endeavors. As a GM, it's an amazing tool for hassle-free game prep and overall campaign management, because Lord knows someone needs to manage the campaign. Forgot the name of that NPC you made up on the fly and the party really seemed to be into for some reason, but haven't spoken to in 14 sessions? World Anvil's got your back. Need to get all those encounter ideas buzzing around in your brain out somewhere meaningful? World Anvil's there for you. Accidentally gave your players a way too powerful magic item, and now you need to come up with a way to nerf it that doesn't feel bad, or modify it in some way that maybe makes the other players more powerful, but not in a way that makes some of the other players jealous of the others, so they ultimately form a mutiny against you and take over your job as GM. Well, you might be cooked, but at least your players will have a detailed record of that magic item, where they got it, and what it does. That's right, folks, it's not just for GMs and world builders. There are tons of player-facing tools to help them take notes and manage their character stories too. World Anvil is used by over 2 million game masters worldwide, and if you want to check them out and see what all the hype is about, you can use my custom link in the description down below to save yourself 51% off of any premium subscription. So thank you very much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. I've got my World Hammer ready. So on that note, let's get back to the courtroom drama unfurling before our very eyes, because Asmodeus is about to discover something that will change the face of the multiverse forever. The thing about the gods and all their fun little projects is that the creation of mortals meant there were now a plethora of entities all across the multiverse, but especially on the material plane, who were in possession of something nobody else had: a soul. But what is a mortal soul? The concept of a soul and what a soul actually is was a pretty novel thing at the time, and very few beings, including the gods, had an accurate and fully in-depth understanding of what could actually be done with a soul. Asmodeus managed to figure out that the destination of a soul after the creature's mortal death was not as set in stone as many others initially believed, and that with the will of the creature's soul attached to some sort of cosmic agreement, the soul could be redirected. So he and his minions began forming pacts with any mortal they could get their little claws on, offering them anything and everything they could to secure the sale. Ancient and forbidden knowledge, riches, straight up power, and any number of boons and vices that you could imagine would begin to flow to the mortals of the multiverse from the 9 hells, and in exchange, myriad souls began to flow in the reverse direction. Once the souls arrived in the hells, Asmodeus had found a way to transfigure them into new devils who would join and bolster the ranks of his armies in the never-ending conflict of the Blood War. And this is how he would ensure there was no shortage of foot soldiers in his war bands. Those who were weak would remain as fodder for the front lines, destined to die again and again and again and again in combat, and those who were strong would gradually rise in rank and power, creating commanders and generals that would lead their lessers into combat. These cosmic pacts made by the devils were incredibly powerful because they not only drew on the perceived weakness inherent to many mortals along with their shortened lifespan perspectives, but they were also backed up by cosmic law, which, as we know, was partially written by Asmodeus himself. During all this, there was a brief window of time where Asmodeus and his scheme went undetected, but it didn't take long before the Celestials got wise to what he was doing and, of course, stepped in to try and put a stop to it. They pointed the finger, claiming that surely Asmodeus and his minions were acting unlawfully in some way and could therefore be prevented from messing with the mortal souls and also punished. It was to this that the Supreme Master of the 9 Hells said, "Bet." Asmodeus was so confident that he was legally in the right, he called up the Celestials accusing him and said, "I will go to trial with you again, just to prove that I've done nothing wrong, and to really get the point across, let's have Primus adjudicate. That way, you'll know I'm not trying to pull anything." And just who is Primus anyways? Primus, the one in Prime, the supreme Modron, is the uncontested ruler of Mechanus, the plane of absolute neutral law. Primus is the chief deity of perfect logic, strict order, and pure law. He is neither good nor evil, but simply seeks to uphold the order of the multiverse, particularly that of his home plane. So if ever there were to be an impartial judge of cosmic law, you couldn't really do better than Primus, and upon hearing what they perceived as a boast from Asmodeus, that Primus should be the one to judge the trial, they agreed instantly, believing themselves to be unquestionably in the right. And so the trial of Asmodeus began, with the ultimate judge of the multiverse presiding over it. This trial dragged on for weeks, as Primus had heard testimony from all manner of beings who had something to add towards the prosecution. One of the best recounting of the events we have actually comes to us from an Aasimar bard by the name of Asmodeus, who wrote a theatrical play detailing the events. According to them, many important beings testified at this trial, including the solar Zariel, who had yet to fall herself and become a devil ruling over one of the layers of hell. One of my favorite details from the play is that apparently the demon prince Demogorgon was also at the trial to give testimony, but his two heads just bickered with one another the whole time about how they wanted to murder Asmodeus, which I'm sure was very helpful. But after every being in the multiverse with something to say had been given a chance to testify and explain all the heinous doings of Asmodeus and his devils, along with why they felt the fiends should be punished, the Lord of the Nine was finally granted an opportunity to offer up his defense. Asmodeus admitted freely that he and his minions had done everything they were being accused of. They did create soul contracts, and they did in fact lure mortals towards evil with the ultimate goal of propagating those soul contracts to as many different creatures as possible. However, these contracts had rules beyond just the contents of the parchment. The terms of the contract were always laid out in a manner that the mortal could understand, and they were never forced to sign a contract by the devil entertaining them. If a contract was signed under duress, say by a mortal whose life was being threatened by the devil in question, it would not be considered valid. If a mortal declined to sign a contract, they would largely be left alone by the devil. And once the terms were signed, the mortal would be granted whatever it was the devil had promised to grant them, and the contract would be considered null and void if the mortal were to die before the devil could uphold their end of the bargain. If a clever mortal somehow managed to turn the terms of a contract against the devil they'd signed it with, that also didn't matter. The terms of the contract were absolute and would still be upheld by the devil and ultimately by Asmodeus. In his words, the downfall of mortals was due to their own ambition, not the devil's influence. He seconded this point by telling the court of the countless horrors of the Blood War and all he and his kind had sacrificed and endured in order to keep the demons of the abyss at bay, concluding by pointing out what was and still is a hard truth for the Celestials of the multiverse to contend with. If he and his devils were to ever cease fighting the Blood War, either because they simply abandoned the front lines or because they were all slain, the first and most formidable line of defense against the abyss would no longer exist, and the demons would surely sow chaos and discord along with bloody violence across the entirety of the multiverse, a series of events which in all likelihood would result in the collapse of all good and certainly of all law as we know it. So not only were his actions regarding the collection of mortal souls entirely legal, but they were also the only means by which the armies of hell would be replenished and strengthened in order to continue fighting a war which every other being in the multiverse stood to benefit from.
I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it.
And the best part of all, the only reason he was even able to do any of this in the first place was because of the contract that he had signed with the gods. The Pact Primeval. The gods had thought the pact would be merely a document to delineate the boundaries of the 9 hells and allow the souls of evildoers to end up there instead of Mount Celestia. but they had not accounted for what Asmodeus would do with the souls after the fact, and that he might push mortals towards evil to purposely make them end up in the 9 hells. As the trial neared its conclusion, Zariel finally gave her last testimony, during which the conflict turned violent, and the Celestials in the room became enraged with Asmodeus and his lack of empathy or accountability. So with the final testimony given and the court erupting into chaos, Primus quickly shut it down and ended the proceedings to begin the process of rendering a verdict. Primus had heard from many beings and had much to consider. Though Asmodeus was undeniably evil, being evil is not what he was on trial for. He was on trial to determine if he had broken cosmic law by luring mortals towards evil in order to collect their souls, and in that regard, a verdict was rendered. Asmodeus was found not guilty of any instance of law-breaking levied against him, and was allowed to walk away from the trial entirely vindicated in the highest court of absolute law the cosmos had to offer. Though he didn't get away entirely scot-free. The one provision to which he agreed was that he would always keep the Ruby Rod of Hell, an artifact of the devil's own creation, with him at all times, and should any devil ever willingly break a contract with a mortal, that devil would be utterly destroyed by Asmodeus and the powers of the rod, making it both a symbol of the 9 hells' power and an object of fear for all of devil kind. So in the end, the so-called Lord of Lies proved himself to be more truthful in his dealings with mortal than any celestial could have anticipated. Manipulative? Sure, but a liar he was not. He walked away a free being with virtually no repercussions, and despite their seething rage, there was nothing any celestial being could do, angel, god, or otherwise. It's often said that devils are manipulative, cruel, and calculating beings. And this story, more than any others, I believe, perfectly showcases that there is a reason Asmodeus has remained the uncontested ruler of the 9 hells since the plane's creation. He continues to masterfully play a game of chess on a board which spans every plane, every god, and every soul. So should you ever find yourself in a position where you feel you've one-upped the Lord of Lies, got one over on him, or otherwise gotten away with something you shouldn't have, just know, you very likely haven't gotten away with anything. For as he said to all the gods upon conclusion of his trial, read the fine print.